In this video, I want to go through the second half of the Unit 2 notes. So we left off last time talking about calcium homeostasis in the blood, that, how basically when we build up bone, or even when we break down bone, it's really a function of the blood calcium level. So it's not a matter of like we need stronger bones or we need weaker bones. I don't know why we need weaker bones, but it has to do with the the blood calcium level. So again, as we talked about last week, if our blood calcium level is high, we're going to use the bone as the bank of calcium. If we have too much calcium, calcitonin is released. It causes deposit of that excess calcium in the bone. That's how we grow the skeleton. That's how we grow, stronger areas in bone. You have to have the calcium to do that. That brings your blood calcium level down. Typically adults are on this side of the story where our blood calcium level dips below where it should be. And we can't risk that because, as we were talking about, blood calcium levels are needed for mitosis and release of neurotransmitter, muscle contraction. Basically, you can't live with a chronic low calcium level. So when the blood calcium level goes down, the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone that stimulates osteoclasts, and osteoclasts break down bone and put that back into the blood. And so with that in mind, as far as locations, like when we say, okay, we have excess calcium, where are you going to put that? Or, I need calcium in my blood, where am I going to withdraw it from? That's what I wanted to start with today. So as far as bone deposit, I'm going to switch to a picture. You might remember that the cell that's responsible for bone growth is the osteoblast. The osteoblast makes the matrix of bone, osteoid. And so in this picture, what they're doing is they're showing us that on the outer periphery of the bone, or what we call the periosteal surface, on the periosteal surface, that's where there are a lot of osteoblasts. And so what will happen when we have excess calcium is that calcitonin will stimulate these osteoblasts to start laying down new osteoid, and that happens right on the outer periphery of the bone. So as far as location of like bone deposit, it's on the periosteal surface, it's on the outer surface, and also it's going to be in an area of mechanical stress. And so when we stress the skeleton, uh, because the calcium is deposited in the bone, and calcium carries a charge, right? The calcium ion, it has a +2 charge. It creates a small electrical field actually when we stress our skeleton, and that small electrical field will attract osteoblasts to that area, so that when you do have excess calcium in your blood, you're going to end up depositing that calcium in that area that's being stressed. So for instance, think of like muscle attachments. So where our muscles are inserting on the skeleton, because we continually stress that area by the muscle contracting and pulling on the bone, osteoblasts get attracted to that area, so that when you have excess calcium, that osteoid deposit is going to go on the area of insertion points. And you can even see, like in x-rays of weightlifters, how the skeleton is being built up where they stress it. And so that's kind of a cool thing, depending on how you use the skeleton, how you use your body, what activities you're into. If you're into a particular sport or activity, then we actually build up the skeleton differently, but we build it up in areas of stress. Now, when we break down the skeleton, and I guess I'll just go to the notes. So bone deposit, bone grows and remodels in response to forces it demands placed upon it. So like I said, it's going to, get built up where we're stressing the skeleton. And there's a lot of evidence for this. Trabeculae forming along the lines of stress, dominant limb has stronger bones, and sites of muscle attachment. I talked about that a little bit. So as far as bone withdrawal, if I don't have enough calcium in the blood and I'm going to release parathyroid hormone and calcium is going to be released from the blood, where are you going to break it down? So to go back to pictures, oops. the osteoclast, you might remember that the osteoclast is the cell that breaks down bone. And the osteoclasts are really found more on the endosteal surface. So in other words, like lining the medullary cavity. So here's a big difference. When we break down bone, we're going to break it down from the inside. So you're not going to change the shape of the bone. You're not going to change the structure or function or anything like that. What we do is we, liquefy a tiny little bit of the inside of the medullary cavity. So you make the medullary cavity bigger. And, in normal life, we're doing both of these things. So we're always, the bone, people think of the bone as a statue. It's not that at all. It's a living tissue that's in a constant state of flux where we're building it up and we're breaking it down, something called remodeling. So that's where we have the bone withdrawal. So that's on the endosteal surface, on the inside of the bone. So it doesn't change the shape, but hopefully that's not a chronic problem because it will start to decrease the mass if you don't have that counter buildup. So that's a little discussion about, where we would expect those changes to occur. So the next thing that I have in the notes, I have two more things regarding bone. One is how bone breaks repair themselves. And you can see I have the steps listed here. I'm going to look at a picture for this. And then there are some diseases that you need to know. So I'm going to jump back to the pictures and look at a picture from our book. So as you know, when we break a bone, it will repair itself. Because bone has such a rich blood supply, the first thing that happens when we break a bone is the blood loss, which is held in place by the periosteum, hopefully. And so it should be, limited by that. But it's just, a huge blood loss, and it turns into basically like an internal bruise slash, clot known as a hematoma. Okay, and so once the hematoma formation is there, the next thing that you have to consider, like with a fracture, is if the broken ends need to be realigned. And so just to show you a picture here, you can see like a dislocation of the bones. We would need to approximate the broken ends here and immobilize it with a cast, something like that, or immobilize it with, a surgical procedure. But that's what's known as a reduction. A reduction would be a realignment of the broken ends, and that can occur, sometimes right manually, right through the skin, like non-surgical, or it could be a surgical case where it's more complex and you have to use hardware to put the pieces back together so that healing happens properly. So once we have the bone ends realigned, what will happen is fibroblasts move into this area, start producing new connective tissue. Blood vessels are going to infiltrate the area. And also right away, within like 2 weeks, we're going to get little islands of bone forming within this repairing area. This is what's known as a fibrocartilaginous callus, or it's also known as a soft callus. This is not a weight-bearing fix. It's not really, bone. And so this would be a point in healing when the bone is still immobilized by a cast, or however, they're immobilizing it so that you don't keep disrupting this, and so that bone continues to develop. Because probably like 4-6 weeks, what's going to happen is bone will replace all of that soft callus, and that's called a bony callus. And this is the point where the repair is considered complete because bone has filled in the break and the cast can come off, and you can bear weight and that kind of thing. But as you can see in this picture, the new bone doesn't match the existing bone, and so remodeling will take place, say, for years after this, and so that will keep minimizing, but it could even, like they're showing us here, like extend into the medullary cavity, and bone extends out on the surface. So at first, it doesn't blend in, but it is repair, and it is weight bearing, and all of those good things that give us a repaired bone. So in our book, they do go through those steps. You can look at a side by side, and in the notes, I also wrote down the main steps. So the blood loss, then you have to have a reduction, which if the skin is open, like surgical, that's an open reduction, surgical reduction. or closed reduction is that mechanical realignment, and that the soft callus forms first, replaced by the bony callus, and then the remodeling occurs, which is just reorganization of the bone that's there. So last thing in our notes having to do with bone are some disorders that are on our syllabus. And talk a little bit about these. So osteoporosis is, I'm sure you've heard of that, very common, right? That's a quantitative defect. So basically, when we were talking about like bone deposit and bone withdrawal, in osteoporosis, that's out of line in that the bone breakdown, the reabsorption is occurring faster than bone deposit. And there's actually an unknown cause for it, although it's associated with low estrogen levels. And so because the reabsorption is occurring faster than the deposit, there's a net loss. So this is an actual bone loss. It makes the bones less dense, weaker, susceptible to fracture. Even if you had enough calcium and enough vitamin D, but someone can still have osteoporosis. And so just to switch to some pictures, here you can see, normal bone, and this is osteoporotic bone, where you can see that the bone mass is lessening. Okay, so calcium is being reabsorbed from the bones and put into the blood. So that is osteoporosis. Osteomalacia, what we would say in adults, or rickets, what we would say in children, that's a dietary deficiency. So it could be an insufficiency of calcium, or it could be a deficiency that's secondary to a vitamin D deficiency, because remember, we need vitamin D to make the hormone calcitriol to absorb the calcium into the blood. And so whatever the source of the problem is, basically we just don't have the calcium. Calcium is not available. Therefore, you do have the bone. Okay, so this is a qualitative defect. The bone is there. It's not that you don't have that. It's just that it's not solidified, and so it stays soft. And actually, osteo, bone, Malaysia literally means soft bones. Osteoporosis, porous bones. So you can kind of tell right in the names of these disorders what they are. And I'll jump over to some pictures for that. That's osteoporosis. Here's rickets. What you want to notice here is the bowing of the legs, because the bones are soft, and so just under the weight of the person, the bones are changing shape. Here's osteomalacia, and you can see it looks like an overall nutritional deficiency in this case, and the bones just changing shape. Here's the Netter diagram showing rickets and osteomalacia. And then the last disease we need to know about, Paget's disease, is kind of like a combination of these things, in that you have both bone reabsorption and bone deposit, but abnormal in both cases. So it's an excessive bone reabsorption and excessive bone deposit. And so what happens is the bone becomes strong in some areas, weak in some other areas, susceptible to fracture, and it could even be misshapen. So just taking a look at some pictures. Here's Paget's disease. They're trying to show us how the osteoblasts are building up one area of the bone, whereas the osteoclasts are breaking down another area, the fracture in the bone. And you can see in this x-ray the skull of the areas that are getting built up, areas that are being broken down. So sometimes this disease will affect just one bone, like the pelvis is a common bone that's affected. And many times this disease is found incidentally because of an x-ray done for some other reason. So it's pretty rare. It affects people over the age of 40. It's thought maybe a virus causes this, but we don't know what causes Paget's disease, but that's a little description of that. So you should be familiar with these diseases. Now, the videos that I gave you on these diseases, let me just show you those. Here we go. They're really great videos, but they definitely go beyond the scope of what you need to know for this class. And so if you're interested in these diseases, I would recommend the videos. I would also recommend the fracture healing, just to see like an animation of that process. Um, but the diseases, that goes into way more detail. So if you're interested, check it out. But if not, um, what you have in the notes is definitely enough to get you through. So that finishes that chapter, chapter 6 in the book. And we don't go through individual bones in the lecture. So in the lecture, I don't ask you, the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals. You get the idea, the bones of the skull. We don't go through the names of the bones in lecture. We just really talk about like the lifespan of the bone. Like we have bone anatomy, gross anatomy, microscopic anatomy, how bone develops, how it grows, how it changes throughout our life. Um, so that's all in chapter 6. So I'm jumping to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is about articulations or joints, where two bones meet. So as far as classification, one way that we can talk about joints is just based on the type of tissue that fills the gap in between the bones. It's either going to be just fibrous connective tissue, that's a fibrous joint, or just cartilage, could be hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. Those are two different types of cartilaginous joints. Or it could be fluid filled, and that's a synovial joint. Joints are also classified based on the amount of movement that's possible. Synarthrotic is no movement. Amphiarthrotic is slightly movable, and diarthrotic is freely movable. So in the notes, I go through. I organize the notes based on the structural type of joint. So you can see I go through the 3 different types of fibrous joints: the suture between the skull, syndesmosis, which is bones connected by ligaments, and agomphosis, which specifically is the tooth anchored into the socket. Cartilaginous joints, there are 2 types: synchondrosis, which sounds a lot like syndesmosis, so be careful there. Synchondrosis, uh, you can tell the cartilage, right? Synchondrosis, that's a cartilaginous joint. That's the one that's made out of hyaline cartilage, compared to a symphysis, which you might have heard of. That is a joint, cartilaginous joint with fibrocartilage. And I did make a video on each of these. So this is my video, so I'm going to depend on that. I'm going to ask you to watch this, the classification of joints I made. Let me just show you those. Okay, so the classification of joints. So here I go through the different types. Fibrous joints, depending on somebody else here, cartilaginous joints is very straightforward. And then synovial joints, I go through what you need to know in this class in this video, but I'm going to jump back over to the notes. So a synovial joint is the fluid-filled joint that has, like, they're all diarthrotic, they're all freely movable. And so I'm going to let you watch the video regarding the structure, because I mark up a picture there, and I think that that will make sense in the structure of a synovial joint. I'll show you some of these other things. So in addition to the synovial joint, there can be modifications. Like a bursa is kind of like a fluid-filled pillow that is within the synovial fluid, and so that when 2 bones are in contact, they don't come into direct contact, it reduces friction. Same thing with a tendon sheath, but a tendon sheath has to do with reducing friction around a tendon. I'll just show you some of these things. And so this is the structure of a synovial joint that I go through in the video that I made for you. This is a bursa, so you can see kind of like a fluid-filled pillow that reduces friction. Compared to tendon sheath is the same thing, really, but it just wraps around the tendon. And then a meniscus is a piece of fibrocartilage that subdivides the joint cavity. So going back to our pictures here, even though it doesn't draw this in, uh, the menisci of the knee are little pieces of cartilage. They're the cartilage that when people say torn cartilage of the knee, that's what they're talking about. And it comes in and it subdivides the cavity. So you can see that that type of structure is going to direct movement much better than having that free open space. And so that uh, is what a meniscus is. And actually, I should mention this too. In that chapter, in chapter 8, they do go through major joints. We don't do that in this class. So if you wanted to look at the knee and the specific tendons and the menisci, you could do that, look at the shoulder, the elbow, right, the hip, the knee. The major ones are in the book. I'm not going to be asking about any of those. I just need you to know about a synovial joint in general, and then you'll take it from there in more advanced classes. So stabilization is a big deal because if we're looking at a joint that just has fluid in between the two bones, uh, they're most susceptible to injury. Okay, and so the more movement you have, the more at any particular joint, the more susceptible to injury. And so some of the ways that we can stabilize this would be, based on the shape of the articular surfaces. Not really in this case, but can you imagine, say, like the head of the humerus, and how it fits into the glenoid fossa? That's considered a ball and socket. Or even like the acetabulum and the head of the femur, how that's a good ball and socket. So the shape could make a big difference. Another possibility stabilizing this is a ligament. And a ligament is a band of connective tissue, a little bit elasticy connective tissue that connects bone. So I'm just going to trace this ligament out to bone. And it goes over top of the articular capsule. Okay, and so this is the articular capsule. I talk about that in the video with the structure of the joint. It's basically a continuation of the periosteum, the fibrous periosteum lined with synovial membrane. Okay, the synovial fluid's in here. And so to make that a little bit stronger, you can have a ligament go over the top of that. So you can imagine if we were like making a science fair model, maybe that one would strengthen it a little bit, but maybe if I had another one that, uh, went over the joint, that would be even better. And maybe if I added another one that's even better, and so on. And so really like the stability has to do with like the number of ligaments. The more ligaments we have reinforcing an area, obviously the more stability it has. So I'm going to go back to the notes. So the articular shape plays a role, the number of ligaments, the more stable, and then the amount of muscle tone can also play a role, which we haven't talked about muscle tone yet in here. But let me just, I know you know what it is basically. So let's say, you have a muscle, and that muscle through a tendon attaches to bone. So I'm going to say, okay, here's the bone, and then let's say here's a joint. Okay, so here's the other bone. Go with me on this one. So what happens is when this muscle contracts, it means that that muscle actually gets shorter. And muscle tone is just a low-level state of contraction in a relaxed muscle. So all of our muscles that we use have muscle tone. The more you use a muscle, the more tone there is, which just means that spontaneously, the more muscle cells are in a state of contraction. So because we have this low-level state of contraction in this muscle, can you see that's going to exert a force on this tendon that's going to pull on that tendon, and it's going to pull this articulating bone into the socket. And so actually the more muscle tone you have, the more stabilizing effect it has on a synovial joint. So I hope that makes sense, and we'll talk about muscle tone more next week. Okay, so as far as synovial joints, you might be wondering about the types because, for the fibrous joints and the cartilaginous joints, I go through all these different types. With synovial joints, they don't really go through types. They classify them based on the shapes of the articular surfaces and also the movement that's possible there. So I have these movements listed in the notes that you should become familiar with. So a non-planar movement would be gliding, say like the two carpals just slide over top of each other. That's a gliding movement. Angular movements, flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion is reducing the joint angle. And so if my fingers are at 180, then you can see if I reduce the angle, if I take it down to 90, that's flexion, extension. If I go beyond anatomic position, hyperextension. Abduction, adduction. Abduction is movement away from midline. Adduction is movement towards midline. So abduction, right, taken away. So abduction is away from midline in anatomy. So you can abduct the arm, adduct the arm, abduct the fingers, adduct the fingers. Hopefully that makes sense. And then circumduction is cutting a cone-shaped piece of air, if that makes any sense, at a ball and socket joint. So you could do this with the shoulder. You could move in such a way that cuts a cone-shaped piece of air. You could do it with the hip. That's circumduction. Rotation is movement around a single axis. So like, for instance, shaking your head, no. That is rotation. You can rotate within the shoulder. You can rotate the hip. Supination, pronation. Supination is moving so that your palms are forward. And then pronation, palms back. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. I'm not even going to try to get that one on camera. So dorsiflexion is lifting your toes off of the ground. Plantar flexion is like pointing your toes or standing on the ball of your foot. Inversion, eversion is a movement. I have some pictures here with the ankles. Inversion is turning your ankle towards midline. Eversion is moving it away from midline. Protraction, retraction is movement in an anterior posterior plane. So you could do this with the jaw. You could protract the jaw, move it anteriorly. Retract the jaw, move it posteriorly. You can do it with the head. You can protract the head and retract the head. Elevation, depression. Elevation to move superiorly, depression to move inferiorly. So shrugging your shoulders, that's elevation, depression. And opposition is a highly specialized movement where we can move our thumb to touch our fingers, which maybe, we take that for granted, but, think of this, try taping your thumb to your palm and going about your day and moving a computer mouse and brushing your teeth and cleaning your house and writing your notes and all that kind of stuff. So to get an appreciation for that type of movement. So as far as the synovial joints go, what I did is I put a chart, which is going to get cut off here. Let's see if I can fix this. There we go. A chart that you can fill out if you would like. I'm not going to fill this out, but I am going to talk about how this is filled out. So I think a good thing to do to fill out this chart is to take a look at a picture in the book that uses the upper limb as an example for every one of these joints. And let me just share that picture with you. Okay, so this is the picture that I'm referring to where using a key, they're showing you the different types of joints. So a plane joint would be like in between each one of these carpals. You don't have a directed movement. It's considered a non-axial movement. You just have like a little bit of sliding, gliding that occurs across two flat surfaces. Hinge joint. A great hinge joint is the trochlear notch on the ulna and the trochlea of the humerus. That creates a great hinge that allows us to flex, extend, and that's the only thing that I can do. So I can't like rotate. You can actually, technically rotate, but that rotation is between the radius and the ulna. It's not involving this joint. That joint can't rotate. It's just a hinge. Opens and closes, flexes, extends. Because I can't rotate or do any other movement, I would consider that uniaxial. Okay, it can only move in that one plane of space. pivot joint would be pivoting around a central axis, like we were saying, the head is a good example, and this is the example I was just referring to actually. So this is the head of the radius, and the radial notch and the ulna allows us to supinate and pronate the hand. And so that's the rotation, the pivot joint that you can see in the upper limb. A condyloid joint, I would describe that as like a modified ball and socket. And ball and socket is just what it sounds like, you know, where the articular surfaces kind of like are molded together. Ball and socket is always multi-axial. It's the only one that's multi-axial because, you know, you might have two planes of movement, but in order to have rotation, you need a ball and socket joint. And so rotation is going to be the third plane of movement. So like the shoulder and the hip are multi-axial joints. And just to go back to our condyloid joint, modified ball and socket, say at the base of the fingers, that's where they're looking. So here's the metacarpal, here's the proximal phalanx. And so they're looking at these joints, right? And so with these, we can abduct, adduct, we could flex and extend, you know, but what we couldn't do is like holding the palm still, we couldn't rotate, you know, the finger, you know, so that my fingernail is not facing the camera. So, so it's biaxial. I hope that makes sense. And you can see these all over, except here's one special one that, you know, make a note of this one in your table, the saddle joint. The only example of a saddle joint where, you know, the two joint surfaces are kind of U-shaped, kind of like a saddle, is the carpo-metacarpal joint. So they're looking at in between the metacarpal and the carpal of the thumb. That's considered a saddle joint, and that's a biaxial movement of abduct, adduct, flexion, extension, but you don't get rotation in that joint. But saddle joint, everyone always uses that carpal metacarpal of the thumb as an example. So in the video playlist, I do give you better examples of the movements than I provided in this video here, and also another little review of the joint types that you might like. So I hope this was helpful, and we'll be on to muscular system next time. Thank you.